The knife was already at Lucian Velkan's throat before Amara Frost even understood what she was doing. She had crossed the marble floor of the Obsidian Court in 7 steps, snatched the ceremonial blade from the pedestal where it had rested for 300 years, and pressed it against the neck of the man who had just ordered Lucian's execution. Her hands were not shaking. That surprised her more than anything else. Lord Casimir Vrath, First Blade of the Nocturne Council, went very still. His silver eyes, ancient and cold as frozen rivers, slid sideways to look at her. The entire court had gone silent. 200 vampires, dressed in their finest dark silks and ancient crests, stared at a human waitress in a black apron, holding a ceremonial blade against the throat of one of the most powerful immortals alive. "Remove the girl," Casimir said softly. "Before I remove her myself, you will not touch her." The voice that answered was not hers. It came from across the chamber, low and absolute, resonating in the chest like a struck bell. Lucian Velkan was still kneeling where they had forced him, his white hair loose around his shoulders, his wrists bound behind him in silver chain that had burned the skin raw. He looked up, and his crimson eyes found Amara across the vast room. She saw something move in them. Something that was not the regal composure he wore like armor. Something that was raw and grateful and terrified for her in a way that broke her heart wide open. She had served drinks at the Thornwick Hotel for 2 years. She had not known, not truly, what went on in the private banquet halls, sealed off with black iron doors. She had suspected. You do not work that close to the truth without eventually touching it. But she had not expected this. She had not expected to walk in on a vampire court-martial, to see the man who had quietly, methodically protected her for 6 months, kneeling in chains before people who wanted him dead. She had not expected to discover that everything she thought she knew about Lucian Velkan was both wrong and completely right at once. This is where the story truly begins. Not at the knife, and not at the silence of the court. It begins 6 months earlier, on a rainy Tuesday night when Amara Frost spilled an entire tray of champagne glasses, and Lucian Velkan caught every single one before they hit the floor. She had been new to the Thornwick. She had taken the job because the pay was exceptional, and the hours allowed her to take evening classes at the university, where she was finishing a degree in forensic psychology that she funded entirely herself. She had no patience for nonsense, a quick mind that noticed details most people skipped, and a stubborn streak that her mother called a gift, and her professors called a liability. The Thornwick Hotel operated on 2 levels. The upper floors were a legitimate 5-star establishment, all polished brass and imported marble, and guests who booked months in advance. The lower floors were something else. Amara's employment was officially with the upper level. But the Thornwick had a way of blurring its own lines, and after her first month, she had been called downstairs to assist with a private function. That was the first night she saw Lucian. He was standing beside a set of double doors at the far end of a corridor that had no windows. His hands clasped behind his back, his posture so precisely still, it bordered on architectural. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black jacket with silver thread at the collar that looked like it had come from a century she had never lived through. His skin was pale as birch bark. His hair was white, not bleached, not fashionable, but genuinely, absolutely white, pulled back at the nape of his neck with a black ribbon. His eyes, when they moved to her, were a deep and startling red. She had stared. She was not ashamed of that. He had not smiled. He had simply observed her the way a chess player observes a board, assessing distances, considering angles. "The champagne glasses," he said, his voice unhurried, accented with something Eastern European and old, "should be carried on the right side, not the center. The ventilation system in this corridor creates a draft from the east. It catches the tray off balance if you center the weight." She had stared at him for another full second. Then she adjusted her grip, moved the tray to her right hand, and walked past him. She did not thank him. She told herself it was because she did not need unsolicited advice. The truth was simpler. She was afraid that if she stopped walking, she would not be able to start again. His name came to her piecemeal over the following weeks. Lucian Velkan, Chief of Security for the Thornwick's lower operations. He answered to someone named Lord Casimir Vrath, though she did not know that name yet, and she did not know what lower operations actually meant in the language of what the Thornwick truly was. What she learned first was what he did. He stood guard. That was the simplest description, and it was also profoundly insufficient. Lucian Velkan did not simply stand in a corridor and look imposing, though he did that with terrifying effectiveness. He observed everything, remembered everything, and acted on what he observed with a speed and precision that she had never witnessed in any human being. She saw him intercept a guest who was moving toward a restricted corridor before the man had even completed the first step in that direction. She saw him place himself, without apparent urgency or alarm, between a heated argument among the Thornwick's more volatile guests and a caterer who had wandered too close to the conflict. She saw him end confrontations with 4 words or fewer, simply by arriving and looking at the involved parties with those quiet, ancient red eyes. He protected people, that was what he did. Staff, guests, even people who probably had not earned it. He did it the way some people breathe, without drama, without expectation of gratitude, as though it was simply the only acceptable way to exist in a space. She watched him for 2 months, before she spoke to him directly. She had been working late, cleaning up after a private dinner that had run well past midnight. She was alone in the corridor outside the sealed banquet hall when she heard it, a sound from the stairwell at the end of the hall. Not a crash, not a shout. A silence that was too deliberate, the absence of sound where sound should have been. She turned, and a man she did not recognize was standing 5 feet away from her. He had not been there 10 seconds ago. He was looking at her with an expression that made her blood pressure spike, something between hunger and calculation. "You should not be in this hall," he said. "Neither should you," Amara replied. Because her mouth operated independently of her fear, he moved toward her, and she had one sharp, clear second of understanding that this was very bad, before Lucian was simply there. Between her and the man, his back to her, his entire presence rearranged from the measured stillness she had grown accustomed to into something that was controlled violence waiting for permission. "Draven," Lucian said, the single word carrying the weight of a final warning. The man called Draven went still. He looked at Lucian for a long moment, something complicated moving through his expression, and then he turned and walked back toward the stairwell and was gone. Amara stood in the silence he left behind. Her heart was performing something athletic in her chest. Lucian turned to face her. He studied her the way he always did, precise and unhurried, and then he said, "Are you injured?" "No," she said. "You should not be in this corridor after night. I was cleaning up. It is my job. Your job ends at 11. It is 20 past 12. She blinked. "You know my schedule." He did not answer that. He simply looked at her, and she had the unsettling sensation of being known, genuinely and completely known, by someone who had been paying attention to her in ways she had never been aware of. "Who was he?" she asked. "No one you need to concern yourself with." "That is not an answer." "No," Lucian agreed. "It is not. She should have pushed. She did not. She took her apron off, folded it over her arm and walked toward the exit, and as she passed him, she said quietly, without looking at him, "Thank you." He did not reply. She felt his gaze on her back all the way to the door. After that, something shifted between them, not dramatically, not in the way of sudden declarations or electric confrontations. It shifted the way light shifts in a room when a window is opened. Gradually, and then all at once, he began to appear whenever she worked the lower corridor, not hovering, not intrusive, simply present the way a fixed star is present, something that orients you without demanding acknowledgement. She started leaving a coffee on the corner of the hall table every shift, black, no sugar, because she had noticed, with the same precision he applied to everything around him, that he looked at the coffee cart when the caterers brought it through, and then looked away without taking any. She never said anything about it. He never commented on it. But the cup was always empty when she returned to collect it. One night in December, when the hotel was decorated in dark winter flowers, and the lower hall smelled of cold stone and old wood, she sat down on the bench outside the banquet hall at the end of her shift and put her face in her hands. It had been a terrible week. Her academic advisor had rejected her thesis proposal for the 2nd time. She had $300 to last until her next paycheck. The radiator in her apartment had stopped working. She did not cry. Amara Frost had taught herself, at some cost, not to cry in front of people. But she sat there in the corridor and felt the weight of everything she was carrying, and she let herself feel it for exactly 60 seconds because she had learned that 60 seconds was sustainable, and anything longer started to feel like drowning. At 58 seconds, Lucian sat down beside her on the bench. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not offer platitudes. He sat with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand was his version of warmth, an absolute, unwavering presence that said without words that nothing would approach her while he was here. After a moment, she said, "My thesis was rejected again." "What is the topic?" he asked. She told him. The psychology of protective behavior in high-risk environments, the way individuals in security or emergency roles developed specific emotional frameworks to depersonalize threat without losing their capacity for empathy. How that balance, when it broke, tended to break catastrophically in one of two directions. Lucian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The flaw in most protective systems is the assumption that the protector does not also need protection." She looked at him. He was watching the far end of the corridor with those red eyes, his profile sharp and composed, and she thought she had never heard anyone articulate something so precisely true with so little apparent effort. "Is that from experience?" she asked. A pause. Yes. She wanted to ask him more. She did not because she could feel the edges of something in that single syllable, something old and carefully contained, and she respected contained things because she knew what it cost to maintain them. "Reframe the thesis," he said. "The advisor's objection is likely that your hypothesis is too broad. Narrow it to a specific subset of protective psychology. Something with enough academic precedent that the committee cannot dismiss it as theoretical." She stared at him. "How do you know what my advisor's objection is?" He glanced at her then, just briefly. "Because the objection you described suggests someone who is uncomfortable with the implied critique of the systems they have built their career studying." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "You are extremely perceptive for a security guard." Something moved across his expression, too fast to read. "And you are extremely composed for someone who has had a genuinely terrible week." She blinked. "How do you know it has been terrible?" "You have been carrying it differently since Monday. The way a person moves when they are managing multiple simultaneous weights rather than a single one." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere above them, the hotel hummed with its own distant life. Down here, it was just the two of them on the bench, and she was becoming intensely aware of how close he was, the warmth that radiated from him, which surprised her, because she had half expected him to be cold. "Lucian," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name directly. He turned to look at her fully. "What actually goes on in these rooms?" she asked. "The lower hall, the sealed doors. The people who come here at midnight in cars that don't have plates." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate. "That," he said finally, "is a question I would advise you not to pursue. Because the answer is dangerous. Because the answer changes things. And some things, once changed, cannot be returned to their previous state." She held his gaze for a long moment. His eyes were extraordinary, that deep, wine-dark red that should have been unsettling, and instead made her feel, absurdly, like she was being looked at by something that had been waiting a very long time to look at something it found genuinely interesting. "I already know you are not human," she said. The silence that followed, that was a different quality entirely. "You have known for some time," he said. It was not a question. "About 2 months," she said. "Possibly longer, if I am being honest about when I started suspecting versus when I admitted it to myself." He studied her. She did not look away. "And yet you stayed," he said. "You have never hurt me," she said. "You have protected me, repeatedly, without being asked and without expecting anything in return. That tells me considerably more about your character than the color of your eyes." He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not softer, exactly. Heavier, as though something he'd been holding up had been gently set down. "The Thornwick is a neutral ground," he said. "A space recognized, under blood law, which is the governing code of the vampiric court structure, as a place where political hostilities are suspended. I am the chief of security because the individual whose protection I am specifically contracted to provide is located here. I am, in the language of our court, a bonded guard. It is a position that carries considerable legal weight and considerable personal risk." She listened. The court I serve, he continued, is called the Nocturne Council. It governs the vampiric population of this city and the 3 surrounding territories. Its laws are ancient, and they are not always just. He paused. What goes on in these rooms is the business of that court. The people you see coming and going are its members. The conflicts you occasionally overhear are its politics. And the man named Draven? She asked. Something tightened briefly in his jaw. A faction agent. There is a group within the council who believe that the blood laws have proven too permissive. That neutral grounds, like the Thornwick, enable political maneuvering that weakens the court's authority. They wish to see the neutral ground revoked and the individuals currently under its protection made legally available. Available for what? He looked at her for a moment. Punishment, he said quietly. For crimes both real and fabricated. She thought about that. And you are in their way. I have always been in their way, he said. That is to a considerable extent the point. She did not speak immediately. She thought about everything he had just told her. Every carefully chosen word, the things he had included and the things she could feel him choosing not to include. And she thought about 6 months of coffee on a corner table and a man who had placed himself between her and danger without hesitation and without being asked, and a bench in a dark corridor at midnight. Thank you, she said, for telling me. You gave me no real alternative, he said, and the faintest thing, not quite a smile, but the structural ancestor of one, moved across his face. She went home that night and sat in her cold apartment with a blanket around her shoulders and thought about Lucian Velkan with an intensity that she recognized. With her forensic psychologist's mind and her extremely honest self-assessment as something considerably more than professional interest. She did not do anything about it. Not immediately. She was not the kind of person who acted on something before she understood it. So she thought about it carefully, with the same rigor she applied to everything else in her life, and she reached the following conclusions. He was not human. He was, in fact, an immortal being of considerable age and power, whose moral framework appeared to be deeply rooted in protection and honor rather than self-interest. He was extraordinarily perceptive, intellectually sharp in a way that made her genuinely excited to talk to him, and clearly capable of emotional depth that he kept under precise, disciplined control. He was also working in a political context that involved danger, ancient law, and what sounded like an escalating internal conflict. And she, Amara Frost, 26 years old, human, with $300 in her bank account and a rejected thesis proposal, was apparently falling in love with him. She told herself she would be careful. She told herself she would be smart about it. She was also, as subsequent events would demonstrate, entirely right to be concerned. Over the following weeks, the conversations became longer. She learned that Lucian was over 400 years old, though he spoke of his age without vanity or drama, the way people describe facts about the climate of a place they grew up. She learned that he had been a guard, in one capacity or another, for most of those 4 centuries. He had served courts across Europe, each bond contract lasting decades, and he had ended each one with his principle alive and intact, and the terms fulfilled. His record was, he said without inflection, perfect. She asked him once if he had ever wanted something other than protection duty. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Wanting and choosing are different operations. I chose this because I was better at it than at anything else, and because doing what you are due and genuinely best at creates a particular kind of peace." He paused. "I have wondered occasionally what it would be like to have something of my own, rather than always standing watch over someone else's." She did not respond immediately. She sat with the weight of what he had just shared and treated it with the careful attention it deserved. "You deserve that," she said finally. "Something of your own." He looked at her with those red eyes, and the thing that moved through them then was something she felt in her chest. Not a flutter, not excitement, but something deeper. Something settling. She began to understand, slowly, that what was happening between them was real. Not infatuation, not the glamour that she had read about and that Lucian had told her with characteristic bluntness that he did not use because he considered it a form of manipulation beneath his dignity. What was happening between them was simply 2 people, across an enormous difference in nature and history, recognizing each other. She revised her thesis. She followed his advice, narrowed the focus. structured it around a specific subset of protective psychology with strong academic precedent. Her advisor approved it within a week. She told Lucian, and for the first time since she had known him, he smiled fully, and it was devastating. Quiet and rare and completely genuine. And she had to look away, because the alternative was to say something she was not yet ready to say. The trouble arrived in March. She became aware of it first as a change in Lucian. Not dramatic. Not visible to anyone who had not spent months learning the precise vocabulary of his posture and expression. But she noticed it. A heightened quality to his attention. The way his gaze moved through rooms with greater frequency. The way he began, subtly, to walk her to the external door at the end of each shift rather than leaving her at the corridor's end. She asked him what was happening. He told her, with the honesty he now extended to her consistently, that the faction within the Nocturne Council had escalated. They had filed what was called a grievance of blood law, a formal legal challenge against the current administration of the neutral ground. Specifically, they had named Lucian as the obstacle to what they were calling a necessary restructuring of court authority. "They want to remove you," she said. "They want to neutralize me," he said. Removal from a bond contract requires evidence of contract violation. They are working on manufacturing it. She felt cold. Can they do that? They have done it before, he said, his voice measured. To others. Vampires who were in the way of someone with sufficient motivation and insufficient conscience. He paused. Lord Casimir Vrath is their leader. He is very old and very patient and very practiced at doing what needs to be done without appearing to do it himself. She filed that name away with precise care. What happens if they succeed? She asked. He was quiet, Lucian. If the bond is declared void on grounds of contract violation, he said, I lose the protections that come with my position. I become legally subject to court judgment. Given the specific charges they are likely to fabricate, that judgment would not be lenient. She understood what he was not saying. She sat with it for a long moment, and then she said, What can we do? The we landed between them. He noticed it. She watched him notice it. There is not a great deal, he said carefully. The legal mechanisms of the blood law court are old and deliberate. An accused party has the right to speak before the full council before judgment is passed. But the council, in its current configuration, is weighted heavily in Casimir's favor. Then we need to change the configuration, she said. He looked at her. Amara, I am not asking you to do something reckless, she said. I am asking you to think about this differently. You have spent 400 years being the most effective person in every room you have occupied. You know this court's structure, its laws, its players, its weaknesses. You have protected everyone around you. Now I am asking you to let someone think alongside you.
He was very still.
Let me help, she said. I am not helpless, and I am not naive, and I am not going anywhere. So please stop trying to protect me from the problem and start treating me as someone who can help you solve it. The silence after that was long and deeply charged. When he spoke, his voice was low. You understand that positioning yourself as an ally in a court conflict exposes you to risk. Yes. You understand that the individuals involved are not constrained by the same moral frameworks you are accustomed to. I understand they are constrained by blood law, she said, which you have told me is taken extremely seriously. I understand that the full council proceeding has procedural protections, and I understand that you know every single member of that council and have had decades to observe what they respond to. He looked at her for a long moment, then he said very, very quietly, What are you proposing? She told him. The plan was not complicated. It was, in fact, built on a principle she had lifted directly from her forensic psychology coursework. People who have spent decades constructing a political advantage become, paradoxically, vulnerable in the spaces where they are most confident. They do not guard the approaches they believe are unassailable. Lord Casimir Vrath was confident that the council, in its current configuration, would rule in his favor. He was confident because he had spent years building exactly that majority. What he had not accounted for was the 3 council members who were not in his majority, not because they opposed him, but because they were neutral, and neutral, in Amara's assessment, meant they were waiting to be convinced. Tell me about them, she said to Lucian. The 3 neutrals, everything you know, he told her. She listened with her whole mind, asked precise questions, and took notes in the small journal she always carried. She cross-referenced what he told her with what she had observed herself on the evenings she had worked the lower corridor. She built a picture of 3 individuals, all vampires of considerable age and weight, each of whom had their own specific set of concerns and about the direction of the council, and each of whom could be reached, not by manipulation, but by truth presented in the right framework. "You cannot speak to them directly," she said. "Not right now, not while the charges are pending, because it looks like you are canvassing for support, and Casimir will use it against you. But I can. I am neutral ground in the literal sense. I am not a council member. I am not contracted to any faction, and the blood law cannot legally restrict my right to speak to anyone in a public capacity." "They will not see you," Lucian said. "A human with no court standing approaching council members would be, at best, dismissed. Then I need a reason to approach them that has nothing to do with you," she said. "Fortunately, I work at the Thornwick, and I have an entirely legitimate professional reason to coordinate with the guests of the private banquet facilities." He stared at her. "I have been here for 2 years," she said. "I know the preferences of every regular. I can walk up to any of those 3 council members and have a conversation about the catering arrangements for their next private booking, and no one in that room will think twice about it. And in the course of that conversation, I can say certain things." "You would be taking an enormous risk," he said. "I know," she said. "I am choosing to." The word choosing landed in the air between them the same way wanting and choosing had landed weeks ago, but in reverse, the mirror image, and she watched him understand that. "Amara," he said, and her name in his voice was different now, lower, like something that had been held very carefully for a very long time. "I know what I am doing," she said gently. "I know exactly what this is, and what it costs, and what it might not be able to fix. I am choosing it anyway. The same way you chose this, the protection, the standing between, the being present without asking for anything back. I am choosing it the same way." He looked at her for a very long time. His expression was doing something she had never seen it do before. Something that was not composure, not assessment, not the regal guarded control he wore like a second skin. Something that was simply him, stripped of all the armor. "I do not know," he said carefully, "how to be protected." "I know," she said. "I noticed." They sat in the corridor, in the quiet, and she did not move toward him, and he did not move toward her, but something between them solidified into something that had weight and mass and permanence. The following 2 weeks were the most carefully orchestrated of Amara's life. She approached the first neutral council member, a woman named Lady Seraphiel, who had attended 3 private events at the Thornwick in the past month, and had very specific preferences about the temperature of the room and the arrangement of the table settings. Amara initiated a conversation about those preferences with professional precision, and in the course of that conversation she mentioned, as though it were an aside, that she had worked in the lower corridor for 2 years and had found the current administration of the neutral ground to be both efficient and fair, that the staff felt genuinely safe, which was not something she could say about every establishment she had worked in, and that she hoped the current arrangements continued because changes in administration always created instability for the people who depended on the environment. Lady Seraphiel had listened with ancient, measuring eyes and said nothing, but at the end of the conversation she had looked at Amara with an expression that Amara's forensic psychology recognized as recalibration. The second neutral, a broad and enormously old vampire named Lord Theric, who communicated primarily in precise, economical sentences and had a deep and poorly concealed fondness for a specific brand of aged whiskey that the Thornwick kept for him in a private cabinet, received a slightly different approach. Amara brought his whiskey to the corridor table herself, rather than through the standard service, and in the course of the entirely professional exchange, she said that she had heard there was some political difficulty at the council level, and she hoped it resolved itself without too much disruption, because stability mattered enormously to people who did not have the resources to weather upheaval. She said it plainly, without artfulness, and looked at him directly. Lord Theric had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "You are very brave for a creature who will not live past a century." "Thank you," she said, and walked away. The third neutral, a young-faced but very old vampire named Corvin, who had come to the Thornwick alone every Friday for 6 years, and always sat at the same table and always ordered the same meal, and always left a very large tip, was the one Amara had been most unsure about. He was quiet and observant in a way that reminded her of Lucian, and she could not tell, from observation, where his actual sympathies lay. She sat down across from him. She had never done that before. It was categorically against hotel staff protocol. He raised an eyebrow. "I apologize for the breach of professional conduct," she said. "I will understand if you report it. But I need to say something to you directly, and I think you are the kind of person who prefers directness." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Go ahead." "Lucian Velkan," she said, "has been a guard at this establishment for 11 years. In 11 years, not one staff member has been harmed on a shift he was covering. Not one guest conflict has escalated to violence when he was present. He has done his job without complaint, without political maneuvering, and without asking for anything in return." She paused. "Whatever Casimir's people are saying he has done, it is fabricated. You know that already, I think. I am asking you to act on what you know." Corvin studied her for a very long time. His expression was unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Because someone should," she said, "and because he would not do it for himself." Corvin was quiet. Then he said, very softly, "You understand that speaking on his behalf in any public forum would expose you to the council's attention." "Yes," she said, "and you are prepared for that." "I am prepared for considerably worse than attention," she said, "if it means the right outcome." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he nodded once, very slightly, and looked back at his meal. She stood up, smoothed her apron, and walked away. 2 days later, the summons came. It was not an invitation. It was not a request. Lord Casimir Vrath, First Blade of the Nocturne Council, had issued a formal convening of the full council under Bloodlaw jurisdiction. Lucian's bond contract was to be reviewed and a judgment rendered. His presence was required. All witnesses were to present themselves at the Obsidian Court, which was in the sealed sublevel beneath the Thornwick itself, accessible by the stairwell at the end of the lower corridor. Lucian told her about it that evening. He told her with the careful composure of someone who has accepted the possibility of a catastrophic outcome and is not willing to inflict his own fear on the people around him. She wanted, very badly, to say something that would make it easier. She did not, because she did not believe in false comfort, and she did not think he would want it. "I will be there," she said instead. "Amara." His voice was quiet and firm. "This is not a proceeding where a human attendee would be appropriate." "I work at the Thornwick," she said. "The Obsidian Court is in the Thornwick. There is no blood law I am aware of that restricts my physical presence in my own workplace." He looked at her for a long time. "Please," he said. And it was the first time he had ever used that word to her, and it undid something in her chest completely. She reached out and put her hand over his, the way she had wanted to for months, and had not done, because she was waiting for a moment that felt right, and this was not that moment, but this was the moment that was real. "I will be there," she said again gently. "Not because I cannot protect myself, because you should not have to be alone in that room." His hand turned beneath hers, slowly, and his fingers closed around hers with a care that told her everything. On the night of the convening, the Obsidian Court was magnificent and terrifying. The sub-level chamber was enormous, built into the bedrock of the city, its walls faced with black marble that reflected candlelight from iron fixtures above. The court seal, an intricate arrangement of ancient symbols in silver, was inlaid into the floor at the chamber's center. 200 vampires filled the tiered gallery around the central space, dressed in their court finest, their combined presence a weight that pressed against the senses. Lucian stood at the center seal in his court formal dress, black and silver, his white hair loose in the traditional way of the accused, his posture perfect and proud despite the silver chains they had placed on his wrists when he entered. He looked to Amara like something from a painting, ancient and terrible and magnificent. Lord Casimir Vrath stood at the head of the chamber. He was old in the way that old things become inevitable to talls and silver-eyed and utterly certain of his outcome. Amara stood at the back of the gallery, in her Thornwick uniform, because she had walked in through the service corridor, and no one had stopped her because, technically, she had every right to be there. Casimir read the charges. Contract violation. Insubordination to council authority. Unauthorized disclosure of court information to an unregistered civilian. That last one landed on Amara like a stone. She understood in that moment that she was the civilian, that she was, under their law, the evidence of Lucian's supposed crime. And she understood further that Casimir had planned this specifically this way because naming her made Lucian's defense harder. Because any declaration Lucian made about the nature of their relationship would only deepen the charge. She watched Lucian's face as he listened to the charges. His expression did not change, but his eyes moved once to her across the chamber, and what was in them was not a plea. It was an apology. She was already moving. She crossed the gallery floor in the time it took Casimir to draw breath for the next statement. She passed between council members who shifted with surprise and cold displeasure. She reached the ceremonial display at the chamber's side, where ancient instruments of the court's founding were kept in glass, and she lifted the one she needed. A long-bladed silver ceremonial knife, the kind used in the blood law's formal proceedings, because she had read enough of what Lucian had told her to know that in the blood law court, a formal challenge could only be recognized if it was made with the ceremonial blade in hand. She pressed it against Casimir's throat before anyone in the room fully understood what was happening. And now they were here, at the knife, at the silence, at 200 vampires staring at a human waitress. "Remove the girl," Casimir said softly. "You will not touch her," Lucian said from across the chamber from his knees in chains. Amara kept the blade where it was. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady too. "My name is Amara Frost," she said, and she said it loudly enough for the entire gallery to hear. "I am employed at the Thornwick Hotel. I am a registered human civilian with no court standing, which means that under Blood Law Section 47, Paragraph 3, which specifically addresses civilian testimony in formal proceedings, I have the right to speak before judgment is passed." She had memorized that section. She had memorized it 3 weeks ago because she had wanted to be ready. The charge against Lucian Velkan of unauthorized disclosure to an unregistered civilian is false. I am the civilian referenced. I came to the information I have about this court through my own observation over 2 years of employment in this facility. Lucian Velkan disclosed nothing to me that I had not already correctly deduced. She paused. Furthermore, I am prepared to register as a court-affiliated civilian, which under Blood Law Section 12 gives me standing as a formal witness, removes the unauthorized disclosure charge, and requires this proceeding to admit my testimony. The silence in the Obsidian Court was total. Casimir's silver eyes had moved from the blade to her face. He was looking at her with something that was, if she was reading it correctly, genuine surprise. And something else. Calculation, recalibrating rapidly. Blood Law Section 12, a voice said from the gallery, is still active precedent. She recognized the voice, Lord Therick. He said it to the chamber at large, not to her, with the flat authority of someone stating an established fact. "The civilian's claim is legally valid," a second voice said. Lady Seraphiel, from the opposite tier, precise and composed, Amara, slowly lowered the ceremonial blade. She stepped away from Casimir with deliberate calm. She held the blade at her side, because putting it down now would look like retreat, and she was not retreating. "I move," said a third voice, and it was Corvin. Standing in the gallery with an expression of complete and settled resolution, to admit the human civilian Amara Frost as a registered court witness under Section 12, and to suspend judgment in this proceeding pending the review of her testimony. The motion required a second. Lady Seraphiel provided it without hesitation. The vote was called. 3 in favor. The rest of the gallery was silent, which under blood law meant that silence was not opposition, and a motion in a formal proceeding passed on plurality of expressed votes if no formal objection was lodged with the ceremonial blade. Casimir had not moved. He was standing very still, and his expression was doing something complex and dangerous, but he was also clearly aware that the legal ground had shifted under him with a speed he had not prepared for, and that any overt action against an officially registered court witness would constitute a blood law violation that would expose him to the very kind of judgment he had intended to visit on Lucian. The council's president official, an ancient vampire called Chancellor Mordain, who had sat in silence through the entire proceeding, like a judge waiting for a good reason to act, raised his hand. "The motion carries," he said. "The proceeding is suspended pending testimony review. The accused's silver restraints are to be removed in accordance with suspension protocol. The removal of Lucian's chains was not dramatic. It was done by 2 court officials with the efficient formality of procedure. But when Lucian stood, and his eyes found Amara across the chamber, it was the most dramatic thing she had ever witnessed. He crossed the chamber floor and stopped in front of her. He was looking at her with an expression she did not have adequate language for, something that was gratitude and fury and wonder, and something deep and warm and absolute all layered together in those red eyes. "You memorized the blood law code," he said. "Sections 12 through 52, she said. "I borrowed your copies. You left them on the corridor table 3 weeks ago. I thought it was probably intentional." A long pause. "It was," he said very quietly. She blinked. "You left them there on purpose." "I left them where you could find them," he said. "Because I knew, if you found them, what you would do with them, and I could not in good conscience encourage you to take the risk. But I could not in equal conscience leave you without the tools if you chose to take it anyway." She stared at him for a long moment. "That is extremely complicated." "Yes," he agreed, "and deeply unfair." "Also yes, you are going to have to stop doing things like that," she said, "if we are going to be in each other's lives. I need you to actually ask me for help rather than leaving tools where I might find them and trusting me to reach the right conclusion on my own." He was quiet. Then he said, "You are telling me how this works, between us?" "I am," she said. "Yes, and you have decided," he said, carefully, as though testing the shape of something new, "that there is an us." "I decided that a while ago," she said. "I assumed you had too." Something that was entirely and unmistakably a smile moved across his face, slow and genuine and devastating, and she felt it the way you feel sunlight after a very long winter. "I had," he said. "I was simply waiting to see how long it would take you to say it first." She laughed. She actually laughed there in the Obsidian Court, surrounded by ancient vampires and black marble and the wreckage of a political proceeding, and it sounded so completely out of place and so completely right that several council members in the gallery made expressions they probably would not have wanted to be caught making. The aftermath took weeks to properly resolve. Casimir's faction did not collapse overnight. These things never did. But the court testimony review, combined with the formal registration of Amara as a court witness, created a procedural tangle that effectively stalled every charge. Chancellor Mordain, who had been waiting for years, it emerged, for sufficient legal cause to review Casimir's conduct, used the opportunity with the thoroughness of someone who had been patient for a long time. What came out during the review was considerable. Evidence of manufactured charges against 3 previous targets of the faction, which had resulted in 2 exiles and 1 execution that was now reclassified as wrongful under blood law. Evidence of unauthorized political communication between Casimir's faction and a rival court in another territory. Evidence, most critically, of deliberate interference in the neutral grounds administrative structure in violation of the blood law covenants that established it. Casimir was not executed. He was stripped of his first blade title, his council seat, and his court standing, and placed under what the blood law called an honor binding, which was a form of enforced political exile that prevented him from holding any position of court authority for a period of no less than 50 years. Given that he was a vampire, this was not a death sentence. It was, however, a complete and total dismantling of everything he had spent decades constructing. Amara, when Lucian explained the outcome to her, thought it was a fitting punishment, not because it was merciful, but because it was precise. It took from him exactly what he had tried to take from Lucian. The neutral ground covenant was reaffirmed. The Thornwick's lower operations continued under the Council's restored administration. The 3 neutrals, Seraphiel, Theric, and Corvin, were all elevated within the Council's new structure, Corvin specifically to a position that gave him ongoing oversight of the neutral ground. Corvin came to find Amara at the end of her shift on the first night the Thornwick reopened after the proceedings concluded. He stood in the corridor in his quiet, observant way and said, "You took a considerable risk for someone else's benefit." "Yes," she said, Most people do not do that. Most people have not spent 2 years watching someone else do it constantly, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, he is fortunate in you. We are fortunate in each other, she said. Corvin almost smiled. It was a very small movement, barely visible, and then he inclined his head in a way that felt like genuine respect from something very old, and left. Lucian came at the end of the shift, as he always did now. Openly rather than through the careful adjacency of the past months. He was out of his court dress and back in the black and silver jacket she had first seen him in, and he came through the service corridor and sat down beside her on the bench outside the banquet hall, with the ease of someone who has decided to stop pretending that this is not exactly where he wants to be. "How is your thesis?" he asked. "Approved," she said. "My advisor called it a revelatory contribution to the field." "Your advisor has finally developed adequate judgment," he said. She smiled. "High praise from you." "It is," he agreed, without irony. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those red eyes that she had spent 6 months learning, and what was in them now was open in a way they had not been in the beginning. Not unguarded, Lucian Velkan would never be fully unguarded, but honest, clear. The way a window is honest when you can see through it to the thing that matters. "I want to talk about what happens next," she said. "Yes," he said, "so do I." "There are things we need to discuss," she said. "Practical things, complicated things. The fact that you do not age and I do. The fact that your world operates under laws that mine does not recognize. The fact that we come from very different places, and that making something real between us is going to require ongoing, deliberate effort." "Yes," he said again. "I am not frightened by any of that," she said. "I want you to know that clearly." "I know," he said. "I have known for some time." She reached out and took his hand the way she had taken it in the corridor before the proceedings, and this time he did not wait. He turned to her, and he lifted his other hand and very carefully touched her face, her jaw, with the back of his fingers, and the care in that gesture was so immense that she felt it like an ache. "I have protected people for 400 years, he said. "I have done it willingly. I have never wanted something else from any of them." He paused. "With you it is different. I want to protect you, but that is only part of it. I want to sit on this bench with you. I want to hear what you think. I want to watch you rebuild a thesis from nothing in 3 weeks using only logic and stubbornness. I want to know what you are afraid of when you are being brave about it." He looked at her steadily. "I want more than the distance I have always kept." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I fell in love with you somewhere around the time you explained the ventilation draft." He was quiet. Something in his expression shifted, very slowly into something that was not the smile she had seen before, but something deeper and less controlled, something that was simply feeling without armor. "I fell in love with you," he said, "when you put a ceremonial blade against Casimir Vrath's throat and did not shake." She laughed again, soft and genuine. "That is a very you answer. It is the true one," he said. She leaned forward just slightly, and he closed the remaining distance between them with the same careful, deliberate precision he applied to everything. And when they kissed, it was not urgent or desperate in the way she might have expected from something that had been building for so long. It was quiet. It was certain. It was two people who had looked at each other from across an enormous distance and walked steadily toward each other until the distance was gone. The months that followed were not uncomplicated. She had been honest about that, and the reality confirmed it. There were conversations about the nature of their different lifespans that were hard and honest and required sitting with difficult truths without flinching. Lucian was frank with her about what the Blood Law Court recognized in terms of human partnerships with vampires, which was less than she would have liked and more than she had feared. There were court appearances for her testimony review. There were long evenings spent going through vampire law, which was dense and archaic, and written in 3 languages depending on the century of the text, and which Lucian translated with patient, unhurried precision while she took notes and asked questions that he answered with the same directness he had always given her. She completed her thesis. She defended it in front of a faculty panel and received a standing distinction, the highest available grade, and the panel chair told her that the section on protective psychology and its application to complex institutional environments was the most sophisticated analytical work the department had seen from a postgraduate student in a decade. She sat in the parking lot outside the university building afterward and called Lucian, and he picked up immediately, the way he always did, and she told him, and there was a silence on the line that was the particular quality of someone who is feeling something very large, very quietly. "I am proud of you," he said, and the simplicity of it was more than any elaborate celebration could have been. She accepted a research position at the university. The hours were flexible, which mattered, because her life was no longer the straightforward shape it had once been. The Thornwick's lower operations remained part of her world, not as an employee but as a registered court witness, and increasingly as someone whose perspective on human-vampire institutional relations was being sought by the Council's new administration. Corvin, who had become the neutral ground's primary overseer, consulted her regularly. She found that she was good at it, the same way she was good at the thesis, because she had a mind that saw the human side of things clearly and could translate it for people who had not inhabited that perspective in centuries. Lucian remained at the Thornwick. He remained chief of security. But his position had been reconfirmed under the new administration, with a clarity and legal protection that it had lacked under Casimir's shadow, and there was a difference in the way he moved through the lower corridor now. Not less precise, not less watchful, but lighter. She noticed it the first week, and she did not say anything, because she thought some things were better noticed and simply held. He began, very gradually, to let things be known. Not dramatic declarations. Not grand gestures, those were not in his nature. But he stopped maintaining the careful professional distance from her in public spaces. He sat beside her when they were in the same room. He touched her shoulder when he passed. He said her name in front of other people without the formal flatness he had previously used, as though it were simply a word that belonged to him. The court members noticed. Most of them adjusted. A few of them were difficult about it, and Lucian handled the difficult ones with the same efficient, 4 words or fewer method he applied to everything, and they adjusted after that too. One evening in late autumn, they walked out of the Thornwick together after her shift and his watch change, and she looked up at the city sky, which was doing something spectacular with the cloud cover and the ambient light of 10,000 windows, and she said, "Do you think about the future, specifically our future?" He walked beside her, unhurried, and said, constantly, What does it look like?" He considered for a moment. "Complex," he said. "Worth it. That is a very practical assessment." "I am a practical person." "You are a deeply feeling person who presents as practical," she said. A pause. "That is a more accurate assessment," he allowed. She took his hand as they walked, and he let her, and she thought about all the ways that the two of them walking through a city at night, was both an entirely ordinary thing, and a thing that had required trust and sacrifice and considerable personal risk to arrive at, and that perhaps all the things that mattered worked that way. "I want a life with you," she said. Simply, directly, the way she said everything. "Whatever shape that takes, with all its complications, I want it." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to look at her, and in the amber light of the city street, was white hair, and pale skin and red eyes were extraordinary. All of him was extraordinary, and he was looking at her with the clear, open expression that she had watched him slowly, painstakingly learn to trust her with. "So do I," he said. "I have wanted it for longer than I had words for." "You have words now," she said. "Yes," he said. "You gave them to me." She did not cry. Amara Frost had taught herself, at some cost, not to cry in front of people. But she felt the warmth of it move through her in a way that was better than tears. A deep and settled joy that did not need expression because it simply was. He pulled her close, his arms around her with the carefully contained strength she had learned to trust entirely, his chin against her hair, and they stood out on the pavement in the amber city light, and she let herself be held by someone who was very old and very dangerous and very deeply, completely committed to her safety and her happiness and her brilliant, stubborn, entirely fearless self. In the weeks and months that followed, the shape of their life together took form, with the same deliberate care they both brought to everything. She moved her research work to a schedule that gave her evenings free. He reorganized his watch duties to create mornings they could spend together, which for a vampire was, he informed her with perfect seriousness, a meaningful sacrifice of sleep. She found this funnier than he felt it warranted. He found her finding it funny more warming than he intended to admit. She met formally the rest of the court's central figures. Some were wary, some were curious. One very old council member named Lady Iolantha, who was rumored to be over 800 years old and who had a reputation for withering disdain toward anything she considered beneath her, looked at Amara for a very long moment at their first introduction, and then said, "You were the one with the ceremonial blade at Casimir's throat." "Yes," Amara said. Lady Iolantha looked at her for another moment. Then she said, "Good," and moved on. Lucian, standing just behind Amara, said very quietly, "That is the highest endorsement she has offered anyone in 60 years. She visited the Obsidian Court officially twice more for testimony. The second time she was no longer a registered witness. She was something the blood law called a designated ally, which was a status with its own specific rights and protections, and which Lucian explained had not been granted to a human in over a century. Chancellor Morden signed the designation personally, and he looked, when he handed her the formal documentation, like someone who had been waiting for this specific paperwork for a long time. She told her mother, eventually, because she was not in the habit of keeping enormous things from her mother, and because her mother was, if anything, more composed in response to extraordinary information than Amara herself. Her mother's response, after a lengthy and very thorough conversation, was, "He sounds like a man who has spent his whole existence becoming exactly the person he needed to be in order to deserve you. That is not nothing." Amara called Lucian immediately after that conversation and repeated it to him word for word. There was a silence on the line. Then he said, "Your mother is extraordinarily perceptive." "It is hereditary," Amara said. He laughed. It was not as rare as it had been in the beginning, his laughter, but it was still not common, and it was still the best sound she had learned in 2 years of learning him. On the first anniversary of the day Amara had stood in the Obsidian Court with the ceremonial blade in her steady hands, Lucian brought her to the Thornwick's lower corridor after midnight. When the hotel was quiet and the corridor was lit only by the warm iron fixtures, he had put 2 cups of coffee on the corner table, one black and one with a small amount of cream, because he had learned her preferences the same way she had learned his, through attention and care. They sat on the bench outside the banquet hall. He said, "I have been thinking about the question you asked me, whether I had ever wanted something of my own." She remembered asking it. It felt very long ago and very immediate at once. "You are the answer," he said. "You have been the answer since the first evening. I simply needed time to understand what I was looking at." She set her coffee down on the table beside the bench. She turned to face him on the bench, tucking one leg beneath her, and he turned toward her too, and she looked at his face, which was the face she had come to know better than almost anything, the precise angles and the red eyes and the rare smiles. And she said, "You are mine too, completely, whatever that means, for as long as I have, for as long as you have," he said quietly, "and considerably beyond in whatever way I can carry it." She reached out and touched his face. He pressed his hand over hers, holding it there. "We are going to be very good at this," she said. "Yes," he said, "we are." She kissed him softly, and he kissed her back with all the care in the world, and the corridor was quiet around them, and the city moved far above. And somewhere in the sealed banquet hall behind them, the heart of something very old and very serious ticked over into something new. And the two of them sat together in the light, the vampire who had protected everyone else, and the human waitress who had finally protected him, and found that the thing they had built between them in blood law and memorized codes and midnight conversations was exactly what it had always been, quietly becoming. A life, shared, complete. Everything else fell into place around that center. The research position became a full academic appointment. The thesis, expanded and published, became required reading in 2 different departments. The court recognized the designation of allied human with enough formal weight that it created a small but meaningful legal precedent for the 3 other human-vampire partnerships that came forward in its wake, people who had been waiting. It appeared for someone to go first. Amara discovered that going first, which had always been her nature, had consequences that spread further than she had anticipated, and she found that she did not mind. Lucian's record remained perfect, he added to it. In the years that followed, the lower corridor of the Thornwick remained the safest space in the court's jurisdiction, not because nothing difficult ever happened there, but because when it did, there was always someone between the difficulty and the people who needed protecting, and now there were two people rather than one. And they worked in a way that was, as several council members commented with varying degrees of grudging admiration, entirely unprecedented. She was not a guard, she was not a fighter, not in the way Lucian was. She did not stand in corridors with ancient authority and the implicit threat of 4 centuries of expertise. What she was the person who understood people, who saw the fracture lines before they opened, who walked into rooms with the ceremonial blade of truth and the steady hands of some who had chosen, deliberately and completely, to be present. Between them, they covered everything. Late in the 3rd year, on an evening when the city was doing something magnificent with first snow, and the Thornwick's windows were glowing gold against the dark, Lucian said to her very quietly, "I want to make this permanent, in whatever language is available to us." She looked at him. "The blood law has a formal bond covenant," she said. "For allied pairs, I read it 8 months ago." He looked at her. "Of course you did. It requires the agreement of both parties, a court witness, and a registered declaration." She paused. "I have thoughts about the declaration wording." He almost laughed. "I have no doubt. Is that a yes?" she asked. "It is the most emphatic yes I have offered anything in 400 years, he said. She took his hand. The bond covenant was performed in the Obsidian Court on a clear December night, in front of Chancellor Mordain and the 3 council members, who had become, in their own way, the witnesses of everything. Corvin served as the primary court witness, which he did with characteristic quiet precision. Lady Seraphiel brought winter flowers that were dark and extraordinary, and smelled of cold stone and old magic. Lord Theric brought his specific brand of aged whiskey, and declared that it was for the reception, not the ceremony. A distinction he felt was important to make. Amara wore dark red, which she had chosen herself, because she had never done things the expected way, and she was not going to start now. Lucian wore black and silver, because some things were simply correct. The declaration they had written together was not long. It was direct and honest, the way they both were, and it said what was true. That they had found each other across a distance that should have made finding impossible. That they had chosen, with full knowledge of what they were choosing, to be present and protective and honest and real with each other. That the distance that remained, the years and the nature and the world they came from, would not diminish what they had built, because what they had built was larger than the distance. Chancellor Mordain signed the documentation with the seriousness of someone who understood history, when Lucian took her hands in front of the court and looked at her with those open, honest, extraordinary red eyes. She thought about the ventilation draft and the bench and the blade in her steady hands and the 6 months of coffee on a corner table, and she thought that love, when it is really love, is always made of small true things accumulated until they become something immeasurable. "I see you," she said to him, which was the only thing she had ever needed to say. "I know," he said. "I see you too." And in the heart of the Obsidian Court, with the city humming far above, and the winter pressing cold and clean against every window, the vampire who protected everyone else and the human waitress who had finally protected him became the kind of thing that the blood law had not quite had adequate language for until now. They walked out of the Thornwick into the snow, and the snow was falling softly, and she tipped her head back to look at it, and he watched her do it with an expression that was everything he had spent 400 years learning how to feel, and was now, at last, allowed to simply be. She took his hand. They walked. The city carried them forward into everything that was still ahead, which was considerable, and complicated, and theirs.